Let's start tonight in 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings 18. Then we'll go back to Exodus 32 where we'll continue our discussion there. One of the things that we talked about last week was the characteristics of the nation of Israel and how they continue in that cycle of idolatry. It doesn't seem to matter what happens and the consequences of that. They only stop for a little while. They don't seem to be able to completely pull themselves away from being idolatrous and following after false gods. Now, we looked last week from Exodus 32, and that account of Moses being on Mount Sinai where he receives the law. When he comes down off the mountain, the people have this golden calf that they've talked Aaron into making for them, and they are dancing and having a big time and throwing a party and worshiping this false god. It doesn't get any better until the 70 years of captivity. It doesn't get better until they are completely sacked and completely destroyed and taken away into captivity, about 586 BC. After that captivity, they no longer dealt with idolatry. There were other sins that they were dealing with, but idolatry was one thing that plagued them all the way through this Old Testament record. In 1 Kings 18, you're familiar with that story where Elijah is pitted against the prophets of Baal. They both have a sacrifice, and the prophets of Baal cry out to their God, and they cry and complain, and they do everything necessary to try to get their gods to answer, and there is no answer from their gods. Then Elijah, not only does he put the sacrifice down, but he pours water over it just as an example of how powerful my God is. He can do it in spite of it being a wet sacrifice. If you pick up in verse 20 of chapter 18, we really need to read 20 through 40. If somebody wants to read about 10 verses and then somebody else pick up and read, that would be great. But we need to begin reading chapter 18 of 1 Kings 20 through 40. Someone wants to start that.
So Ahab sent all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together in Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go living between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is, then follow him." And the people did not answer a word. Then Elijah said to the people, even only I, am left the prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let two bulls be given to us, and let them choose one for themselves, and cut it to pieces, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire he is God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose yourselves one bull and put it for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, and put no fire to it. And they took the bull, and it was given to them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from the morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, Cry aloud, for he is your God. Either he is easy, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep. They must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom, and the swords and lances until the blood gushed upon them. And at midday they raved on until the time of the offering of obligation. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention.
And Elijah said to all the people, Come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a third time, he ordered, and they did it the third time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Then Elijah commanded them, Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there.
Okay, thank y'all for that. That's quite a scene, isn't it? As Elijah and these 450 prophets of Baal are in this face-off, so to speak. It's interesting that the prophets of Baal have this custom, it seems, that they would cut themselves and bleed and do all kinds of things like that. What's interesting to me that little section right there is that Elijah really pokes fun at these false gods by saying maybe he's gone to the bathroom, or maybe he's on a journey, or maybe he fell asleep. That's pretty straight in your face, isn't it? But remember, as this started, what Elijah was saying was, folks, it's decision time. It is time for you to come to a conclusion about who you believe God really is. Who's the real God? You can't waffle back and forth. You can't choose Baal and God. You can't choose Baal sometimes and God sometimes. You can't do any of that. You've got to make a decision. So this is going to be a visual that anybody that sees it, and by the way, anybody that hears about it, would recognize the power of God and be convinced that the God that the Israelites serve and are supposed to be serving is the true God. Because Baal didn't answer. Baal did not come down and consume the sacrifice that was being offered to him. He didn't answer. And to make it more difficult, Elijah has all this water poured on and the ditch around it, and it's all full of water. Not only did he consume the sacrifice, but he consumed the stones and the water. It's quite a fascinating scene where God's power and strength is exhibited, and the significance of that moment is to convince the children of Israel that worshiping idols or worshiping false gods is useless. If you remember last week, we started out in Isaiah 44, and from there, Isaiah was talking about the fruitlessness of false gods. There is no benefit. It is exactly opposite of what God has told us that we need to do, and Isaiah really is straightforward with that statement. So now you have further into the future than we're in Exodus 32, but I wanted to start with this because it's one of those many illustrations in the Old Testament where God's power and strength is evidenced, and as a result of that, everybody who sees it and hears about it should be wholly convinced that God is God, that there is no other God. And as the Israelites observed this, you might remember that at the very end of it, it says, when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." How long would that last? How long would it last? It wouldn't last very long. If you want to go back to what we began to talk about last week, which was that here they are camped at Mount Sinai. Moses is up on Mount Sinai there, where he's receiving the law. He's been in conversation with God now for 40 days. But it hasn't been that long since the Israelite nation witnessed 10 great plagues. Hasn't been that long. Not only did they witness 10 great plagues, but you remember what happened when they're camped at when they're stopped at the shore of the Red Sea? The Egyptians are on their way, and they are trapped between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. And God delivers them by parting the Red Sea. So not only do you have the 10 plagues, but you have this parting of the Red Sea, and you have everything that God does for them from that time on till the time that they're at Mount Sinai. So when we get to Mount Sinai, it is no different. It has been in their recent memory. It's something that they couldn't forget. It's something that they wouldn't be able to get out of their mind because they saw those 10 plagues. They saw the water part of the Red Sea. So all of that took place, it's almost by the time you get to Exodus 32, their mind just went blank. There was just no realization or understanding or comprehension that the God that has delivered them out of Egyptian captivity is the God that they ought to be serving, not a golden calf. And now here they are, Elijah, prophets of Baal, this face-off, and the proof is perfect proof. They cried out to their God for hours. He didn't respond. God responds. The Lord be the God of Israel. But it just didn't last. So there's their history. The history of Israel seems to be wrapped up in this idolatry that seems to plague them every turn they make. Any observations you'd like to make before we move back to Exodus 32?
At this point, they're really not all that far removed because their only way to know things basically was by people telling them, their ancestors telling them. And their ancestors had actually seen these things and witnessed these things. And they had seen the other kings prior to Ahab. They had seen how blessed they were with David. And when they did right with David and Solomon and even Saul, how that God blessed them and won their battles for them. And then when they did wrong, He turned over.
Right.
And it's the Israelites are that way. You know, we at one time I taught that class up there. It's like a continual thing with them. They come back to God, they stay a while, they sin, they cry. He sends us somebody to help them, and off they go again.
Yeah, it is that never-ending cycle that you talk about for sure. That seems to be their character. Anything else?
Sounds a lot like Christians today.
Oh, kind of like folks we know, right? I heard somebody say not long ago that one of the reasons they like studying the Old Testament is because it's about real people like us, imperfect. And it's interesting that God would write the Bible and put everything in there that demonstrates the flaws of His people. So I guess if there's hope, that proves there is hope, because even David would be a man after God's own heart. You have many who were Abraham, father of the faithful, and he was far from being perfect. Okay, Exodus 32, verse 7, I think, is about where we were last week. And what we have is Moses and Joshua are coming down off the mountain, and there is this noise as if it was the noise of battle, and actually what it turns out to be is the Israelites have convinced Aaron that we don't know where Moses is. He's not coming back. We don't know if he's ever coming back or not. He's been gone so long, and we need somebody to lead us and to guide us. And so what we're going to do then is we need a God to worship. And so the people took off their rings of gold and their earrings, and they brought them to Aaron, and he received it all. And he fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they are, as the verse 6 says, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The idea being revelry, not in a very wholesome atmosphere, from what I understand would be taking place there.
That golden calf thing was a way of trying to manage their anxiety, because they're like, hey, we don't know what's happened to Moses.
Mm-hmm.
We need a God to go before us. They don't say to worship, they say to go before us. Like, where's our leader? We need somebody to go ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as that has happened, then they just party and have a good time. It's like they needed that to. Their lack of faith resulted in anxiety that they needed to find some other way to manage.
That's very true. I think one of the things that is characteristic of human beings, and I think that's part of the problem that the Israelites have, is there's something that's comforting about having that statue or that ability to look at something and say, well, there's my God. Something from that perspective. And that may very well be true, what Gary says.
The people that make good team players don't always make good leaders.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Maybe he's talking about Aaron there. Aaron was a good team player, but he didn't do very well when it came to keeping everybody straight there. Okay, so remember that what has taken place is that the Israelites are God's chosen people. They are going to be blessed by God. He told Abraham that through your seed will all nations of the earth be blessed. I'm going to provide you a land. I'm going to make you a great nation. In order to be a great nation, they had to have people, they had to have land. And then he says to Abraham, your seed is going to provide many offspring. You'll have many offspring. make of you a great nation. He even changed his name so that it would symbolize the fact of his being the father of many nations, or the father of nations. So the moment that's what's taking place in this moment is moving toward what God has promised his people, which is that he's going to move them into their land. He's going to give them this land to live in. Abraham has already marked it off. He's already walked it. He knows where it is. He knows what it is. And so now you've got the generations that are past him now, and they come out of this Egyptian bondage, and so here they are on their way to the promised land. And this stop at Mount Sinai was a necessary stop, because this is the point where God is putting down in, I guess this is kind of a play on words, but he's putting in stone his covenant with the people. He's putting it in stone. And so the Mosaic covenant that we talk about a lot when it comes to the Bible, being one of those times when God changes the way that he deals with the people, and he does that here with Moses on Mount Sinai, because Moses receives the law, he receives the 10 Commandments, he receives instruction about the tabernacle, the priesthood, he receives all kinds of instruction. So this moment in the history of the nation of Israel is very significant. It's so important, because this is the prerequisite for what's about to happen. In order for them to inherit and to move into the land, God has created and is molding them into his people through this covenant. So this covenant, the covenant with Moses, the Mosaic covenant, is going to be the very heart of what's going to be taking place from this day forward. But immediately the people are in this idle mode. So that puts strain on that situation. What's interesting is that by the time you get to verse 11, that Moses becomes the intercessor for the people. And I think Gary brought this up last week, that one of the things that God is doing here, I think, is that he knew what was going to happen. He knew before it happened what was going to happen. And so he lets it play out in order to teach Moses leadership lessons. So it plays out so that Moses, God says, your people, and then Moses turns it back to God and says, your people. And so we're in this difficult situation where Moses is the intercessor between the people and God. Somebody read 11 through 14. Better pick up in 7 through 14, if you would, please.
And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf, and have worshipped it, and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you.' But Moses implored the Lord his God, and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger, and relent from this disaster to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people.
Okay, thank you. So, God's words are stinging to Moses' ears, aren't they? Moses is greatly upset by what he hears from the mouth of God. So, he turns and he begins to be the one who will plead the case of the people before God himself. Let me see if I can explain it. If I can't, then I'll let Kevin do it. God has, from the very beginning, put faith in that equation. Relationship with God is led or is guided or is dominated, I might say, by our faith. Why did the children of Israel not enter the promised land this time? A lack of faith. They were not ready. They were not faithful, and so they weren't able to enter the promised land. So they wandered for 40 years. So the very idea of faith is strong in the Old Testament. It is strong with Abraham. It is strong with the nation of Israel as you work your way through the Old Testament. Faith is a dominant and a predominant theme through the Old Testament. So he's always had that. He's always put faith in that equation. So when Moses turns to God, there seems to be something about Moses. Now, maybe it's because he's been with God now for the last 40 days. Maybe it's because he's established this closeness and this unique relationship with God over this time. Or maybe it's simply because Moses has this level of faith where Moses can then turn to God, and in God's, looking at the very presence of God, we won't debate that. I mean, he's communicating with him, whether he sees him or not. But in all of that, Moses pleads with boldness and faith, doesn't he? He pleads with such boldness, and he makes the points that you would think that a leader of men would make. He goes to battle for the people. Now, Moses wasn't real excited about going to battle for the people when he was called from the burning bush, was he? As a matter of fact, when God said, "Hey, Moses, I want you to go into Egypt. You're going to deliver my people," Moses kept coming up with all these excuses. He wasn't very excited about that. Once he got there, once he saw the power of God, once his faith had grown by, I mean, can you imagine if you're in Moses' shoes, sandals, what he saw and what he witnessed? I mean, he's the one that God said, "Stretch out your staff over the waters of the Red Sea," and they parted. So Moses has this boldness and this faith about him that he will turn to the righteous God and plead for the people. I find that so fascinating, so amazing and wonderful in this story, because it shows Moses' leadership, but it also shows Moses' faith and Moses' confidence in the God of heaven. All right, any observations you'd like to make?
That's what he builds his argument on. He doesn't argue anything about the people.
Mm-hmm.
He argues about God's character and God's faithfulness. He says, this is about your reputation, and this is about you promised, and this is about your choosing, and this is about what you said you were going to do. And it's interesting that, Abraham tried to make intercession for the city of Sodom. And Abraham said, "Oh, if I can find 10 righteous, if I can find 5 righteous, if I can find..." That's not where the intercession comes from, because you can't argue about how good the people are.
Right.
And Moses is successful with his intercession because it's about the faithfulness of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and that's the case for us too. The only way Jesus intercedes on behalf of us is in the faithfulness of God.
Right.
So,
Yeah, very good point. Gary makes the point very well, and it is that Moses' argument is about the faithfulness of God and God's commitment to his people. It's not about how good the people are. And maybe that was one of those wake-up moments for Moses as he realized finally, I understand what grace really is all about. Yeah. Other observations? Yes.
That's in fact actually what I would say, at least there was one person that God could have trusted.
Mm-hmm.
Either with Abraham or with Moses.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say the same thing. Abraham was so confident in his relationship with God that he could dicker with him. And, I don't think I could.
Yep. Well, yeah, and the point being that the bargaining was based upon the righteousness of the people, not trying to convince God to do the right thing.
I think that's what God wants from us too. That relationship.
Yeah.
Where we become boldly before Him.
Exactly.
Don't you think there's a little bit of frustration there too? Because Moses has just gone through all this to get them out, to bring them back, to take care of them. He didn't want to do it. And all of a sudden, they're just going to be killed. Why didn't you just kill them before?
Mm-hmm.
Man, there's got to be.
I imagine that Moses, when he heard those words of God, had one of those wide-eyed moments. It's like, really? Yeah, is that, you would do that? Could you really do that, God? You may be right, Brendan.
There, if you notice, God told him to go down to your people.
Yes.
But my people, Lord, is your people. And you think Moses at that time, I don't know, maybe thought of that and then thought, okay, if it's my people, then I will do what you would have done. I will argue on their behalf.
Yes. I think you're exactly right. I think that's, from my perspective, it is that when God emphasizes that these are your people, Moses has already taken ownership of these people because he's led them now through the 10 plagues, across the Red Sea, to Mount Sinai, and he's invested in these people.
After they sin, they couldn't be God's people.
Yeah. But he pleads with God to be God and be forgiving. Yeah.
I think part of that too, though, is Moses has grown in his relationship with God, and he's, in a sense, seen God on the mountain. And so he's not as much arguing on behalf of the people, whoever they may be, as much as he is arguing his relationship with God. This is about your name. This is about your promise. This is about, who cares whose people these are? You're my God, and this is your this is your show.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the emphasis of being Moses understands God's love for the people. I think to whatever extent he understood that, and he pleads with him from part of that perspective. I think. We see Israel is God's property. They are His people. He has saved them out of Egypt for His cause, and He brought them into existence through Abraham, who had no sons, and so you have Sarah and Abraham who bear Isaac, and then you have the great nation of Israel that's going to come from Abraham's seed. They are His glory. They have been delivered by His grace. They have been brought out of this bondage because He has a purpose for them. And He's fulfilling that promise of giving them the land, moving them into that promised land where they will experience all that He's promised them they would experience. Bounty and blessing and fruit and all that comes from relationship with God, and that's His plan. That's what He wants. So His pledge to them in the form of this covenant that He's shared with Moses on the mountain, and now He's greeted by this. It's quite a turn but it is one of those things that shows us the habit of this people as they work forward into the future. In 15 through 19, you have that section of Scripture where Moses breaks the tables of the testimony. As Joshua waited for Moses to return and they enter the camp of the Israelites, they approached the camp, and as I said before, Joshua said it sounded like the noise of war, and Moses heard the revelry that was going on, and he'd been told by God what the people were doing, so he said, you need to get down there. Your people are not acting the way they ought to. And so Moses is carrying these 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, these stone tablets. And once he came in view of the valley and saw the condition of the people and what was going on, the revelry, the dancing, the disgraceful scene that possibly he saw, as he saw this, it seems he was overcome and threw down those tablets and broke those. Hence, the greatest Old Testament joke ever made, right? Moses broke all 10 Commandments at one time.
That Moses went up the mountain and Joshua his assistant went with him. But then there's no more mention of Joshua until this point. So you don't know how far he went up the mountain with him, or how much of all of that he heard or experienced. But I completely forgot about that, because thinking about Moses on the mountain and Moses' interaction with God, and you almost forget that Joshua is there.
Right.
But then Joshua is the guy who ends up leading them into the promised land. And you kind of have to wonder if there's a lesson in there about leadership development. Like, shouldn't it be the case that the leaders of the church today are mentors to the next generation, and leadership is being prepared now for the service that is to come, and being brought into the presence of God now while I'm going into the presence of God, so that they're prepared for when it comes their time to lead?
I agree. I absolutely agree with that. The evidence doesn't give us anything on what happened or how much Joshua was included in this relationship between Moses and God, but he had some part in this. He went at least part of the way, and as a result of that, we get that good illustration, I think, that you give there, Gary, that we should be that kind of leader to take those who are future leaders under our wing and show them what leadership looks like and how to lead, and what kind of lessons need to be taught. Good observation. All right, let me just close. Our time's up. So let me just close with this observation that Moses is see, how can I put this? His heart is splayed open. He is brokenhearted. He is angry. He is witnessing what he never would have ever expected, and he shows himself by breaking these tablets. His indignation, his heartbreak, all that he may have felt because of what the people are doing. And that's where we'll end tonight there. Thank you all for your comments.